All right, good afternoon, everybody. I guess we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm John McSorley. I'm the director of Critical Infrastructure Protection Team here at Amtrak. With me is Justin Smith.
I'm a tech director for security architecture.
And this afternoon, we're going to kind of talk about some of the challenges on OT cybersecurity, specifically integrating OT cybersecurity or OT systems with IT or cloud. So as Jesse kind of mentioned earlier in his presentation, right? Amtrak has a lot of opportunity for expansion and growth from the funding from the IIJA. And so, Amtrak, we've been around for about 50 years, just had our 50th last year. We service lots of people, lots of destinations all across the country. So in looking at what we want to do over the next 15 years, right? Significant expansion across the board, going into new communities. And what that brings with it, right, is a lot of innovation, a lot of projects to expand. And this drives, traditional OT technologies, to integrate with newer existing IT technologies or to be pushed into the cloud. So again, this is just kind of basically all these slides are, we have a lot of projects that are going to be coming down the pipe in the next 15 years. A lot of new technologies that are going to be integrated with existing old technologies, right? And the challenge is, how do we do that in a safe and secure manner? So my team is a relatively new team here at Amtrak. We were stood up recently, and our sole focus is on OT cybersecurity, right? So my team is there to kind of poke and prod and abuse these operational technology systems to understand where our vulnerabilities lie, right? And do our existing security controls, safeguard these systems, or do we need to look at new ways of doing things to protect these systems? So basically all that is just, a lot of poking and prodding and abusing systems.
And on the other side of that, we have the Amtrak Cybersecurity Architecture team, which is largely responsible for designing the solutions that are going into place out in the field. We're rather large on the IT or enterprise side. I think we have about 60 or 65 projects that are in our portfolio right now across Amtrak, both in the digital space, construction projects, the whole 9 yards. And then you have myself, where I really only work on OT projects. Now, the interesting thing about this is there's been a lot of talk about frameworks, standards, maturity models today. This came to me very quickly when I started at Amtrak, that there's this entire arm of cybersecurity that exists, not outside of cyber, but governing over cyber. So everybody knows your GRC, your governance, risk, and compliance, your enterprise architecture. Amtrak has laid a security architecture on top of those two arms. So really your GRC says what we have to do. Enterprise architecture and security architecture says this is how we do it. And then we get into a feedback loop with Amtrak Cyber and Amtrak IT. So really from the bottom up, we're writing our strategy, standards, policies, procedures, and then my team comes in with the controls. And one other important note on that, once we feed all of that information up into cyber engineering and Amtrak IT, the feedback loop comes back down to us and says, this is working, or this is not working, or we need to change this, or whatever the case may be. I did not intend for this to have a lot of overlap with some of the other presentations today, but I feel like the rail industry is really on a very singular brainwave or brain level right now. We're all kind of thinking the same thing at the same time. Not that that's unusual, but really everybody is kind of in relative proximity in terms of maturity in their infrastructure. So while I won't talk about any project specifically, everything that we talk about here is something that we're either currently looking at, considering, trying to figure out how we do it, whatever the case might be. And right now, one of the biggest topics is converging networks, right? So traditionally, ICS, we look at the Purdue model. We really don't go much outside of that. Now we're starting to see vendors come in with tools or solutions that could have a cost savings implication for the company. It could have a safety impact. It could have a number of, maybe we don't need to lay 50 or 60 miles of fiber. We could do this if we just shoot this out over our enterprise network into the cloud or something like that. So in some cases, there are huge cost saving considerations that come with cloud. And one thing that over the last 5 or 6 years, I feel like we've said all the time, and really the day of reckoning is now, is that the cloud is coming and we're really not going to be able to do anything to stop it. So we need to figure out, how do we do this before, while the field is relatively green, how do we do this without creating any major risks that we're going to have 5 or 10 years from now have to go back and figure out. So we're dealing with many vendors, suppliers, providers, all moving to this kind of cloud first connectivity model. Amtrak is no different. We're certainly taking a look at, did somebody touch a PLC back there? So we're certainly considering all of these approaches. We don't view this as a bad thing. You always hit your pockets of engineering where they say, absolutely not. You're not putting my system on the network. Safety systems are up at the top of that list, but where there is a will, there is a way, and that goes for the attacker as much as it does for the defender. So a lot of clear, undeniable advantages. There are also a lot of clear, undeniable risks if we don't approach them carefully. So part of our process and our approach is, amongst other things, we like to embed a security architect in with a project at Amtrak as early as possible. The relationship can sometimes be, tumultuous, to say the least. Sometimes the relationship is great, but really our mission, our job is to get in there and help the project team accomplish their mission while accomplishing our mission of keeping the asset or the resource safe. And there are a lot of ways that we do that. And in terms of looking at it from a converging connectivity or a cloud first approach, some of the risks, obviously it goes without saying that we're extending traditional closed systems. And the first question that I always ask is, how positive are you that that system is really closed, and how long do you believe that it's really been closed? Almost 9 times out of 10, the system is not closed. There is a lot of ambiguity about how it actually works. My job is to get in and figure out how it works and then help the system operator identify, well, maybe it really isn't a closed system, and usually it's not. There are only a couple that I can think of that are truly closed.
I was gonna say, it's a question of, do you think or do you know?
Yep.
Right? A lot of times that answer is we think it's closed or we think it's this, but do you really know?
Yep. And one of our first questions is, okay, you say it's closed, show me the architecture. Let me see on a drawing. Let me prove it to me, basically. And that's where, the relationship can take a couple of different directions. But on the flip side of that, part of including our security architecture team is, if there isn't documentation for some reason, which usually there is to varying degrees of effectiveness in documentation, the security architecture team helps build that. We've brought in assessors, we've done architectural reviews. There are a lot of things that cyber has brought to the table that I don't think many expected us to bring to the table.
Yeah, I'll say that, documentation is great, right? That's the foundation of things, right? But I think we've all probably experienced, right, the divergence between documentation and implementation, right? Especially for systems that have been there or grown organically over time. That's one of the things my team helps with, right? Is we will go in and determine, is this, actually configured and built as designed, or have changes been made, throughout the system that have introduced risk?
And we've said it a few times, these systems are often designed, we're looking at train sets right now where I believe the contracts are 40 or 50 years worth of a lifespan. How do you build an IT system that is going to last that long? And then we'll go back and we'll look at the contracts, and the contracts don't efficiently support a 50-year lifespan. So we have to introduce 5-year tech recycles. In terms of cloud technology, there's no way that the cloud technology that we're evaluating right now is going to be the same 10 years from now, even 5 years from now. It's probably going to double or triple in capability. So there's a lot that we have to look at. And at Amtrak right now, we're making an honest effort to get ahead of this curve the best that we can, while dealing with everything that we have to go back and rework. So I believe Jesse mentioned it earlier, Amtrak has adopted NIST. In OT, obviously, there are a lot of other frameworks that we follow. I'm a member of the APTA Control System Cyber Working Group. We talk to the vendors all of the time. It's routine for me to send an email, try to get vendors or partners in on small conversations just to dive into how things work. we always break it down into the NIST cyber framework. On the architecture team, we actually write a report as we're going through the project. And it's our job to go into each of these 5 areas and try to figure out what are our risks, what are our weaknesses. And then we design the controls and the technologies, well, not so much the technologies, but the controls that we're going to try to lay on top of that project to accomplish the mission and keep it safe. So, I won't go through all of these, obviously, but there are a lot packed in there and this is me thinking broadly, no system identified, just these are the things that I see all the time when I'm dealing with an OT system. And I will call out the very first bullet is that the asset inventories, the software inventories, the bill of materials for the hardware and the software, it couldn't be any more important at this point in time. And I'll rewind it to last year, Log4j. If you're an operator, did you have any idea where Log4j was in your OT network? Probably not. We have really no software bill of materials. We don't really know what's out there. We can't scan it with Nessus, so we're behind the gun here and trying to figure this out as quickly as possible. So I would not be surprised to see software bill of materials as requirements in the future. Protect, we start to really dive into this. Protect, we have our standard images and tools that we deploy to all of our assets on the enterprise side, not so much on the OT side, right? So we're writing it into requirements now that if a system needs to be imaged, you'll get your image from us and it'll have our standard tools on it. And we're not worried about, are those tools going to break the system, because we already know it will. It's our job to figure out how do we get those tools in there without tuning down the posture and have the system work, right? Now, the flip side of that is how many systems do we have that Amtrak doesn't technically manage? Tons, right? Just about everything that goes on the network to some degree is managed by a vendor. And that's another challenge space for us. So say that we scan a system, we identify some vulnerabilities, we're left to ask the vendor to patch those now, right? So we're looking at architectural concepts to be able to enable our OT environments to do a lot of this stuff with the least amount of impact or risk introduced to the network to Amtrak.
So to kind of go off, Justin's point, right? So the architectural considerations are great going into the design. That's where I come in, is after design comes, is implemented, right? I try to poke holes in the design or, abuse it to see if I can do things, right? And I'd say Justin's absolutely correct in that asset inventory and software inventories are critically important, right? If you don't know what you have, how can you protect it? So another thing that helps with, from a security consideration, right, is identifying your crown jewels, right? What are the most important systems within your infrastructure? Dedicate and prioritize those for resourcing. Security at the beginning of a project is a lot easier than security brought in at the end of the project, right? I think we've all probably lived it where, we've had some important initiatives that have been coming down the pipe. I can think of one where we had a new safety system we wanted to implement, and security got brought in maybe a little later than they should have, and we had some concerns that we wanted to address. But in that context, right, you're looked at as the bad guy, right? You're inhibiting progress. And one of the things about helping to influence culture, right, is to help people understand, right, cybersecurity is a part of safety, right? In the rail industry, safety is paramount. So if you can get folks to kind of buy onto that concept of, we're here to make sure that your safety system is indeed safe, right? And, we can help push this through to where it truly is a safety system on, all facets, right? Both physical and cyber. Another fun thing, especially when you're talking cloud integrations, right, is your third-party demarcations. So, where does your responsibility end and where does the third party start? Is that clearly defined, right? Is the third party that you're working with, do you have SLAs in place that require them to notify you in the event of security events? Or do you have something in place where you're integrating with their SOC or their reporting systems so that your SOC can get those reports and you can monitor that as well, right? Those are all considerations that, we need to start thinking about when we start integrating with these cloud environments and third parties. Let's see. What's the other good one? So detection. Detection, I think, is key, right? Especially when we're going across security zones, when we're talking about, OT systems connecting through IT systems to the cloud, right? Where are we doing our detection at? Is it on endpoints? Is it on the network? right? How are we doing detection in the cloud? Are we leveraging cloud native security tools based on whatever cloud platform we're going into, right? Azure, AWS, Google, they all have native cloud security tools. How are we integrating those into our detection frameworks, right? Are we? Is that going to feed back into our SIEM so that we can have centralized monitoring across the entire thing, right? We don't want it siloed, right? We don't necessarily want, I have some OT detection capability, I have some IT detection capability, but they're kind of siloed, right? We want something that gives us a holistic picture across, the entire enterprise. Working with, my team, we work very closely with security architecture. We work very closely with the service owners, right? The people that own the operational technology. We work very closely with the SOC. And the key is, right, is to run through these scenarios, to exercise these scenarios, writing out playbooks. The attack framework is something that we've used to help illustrate scenarios and then run through them so that, all the key components are aware of what their responsibilities are in the event of an actual incident. I think a lot of this stuff has already been hit pretty well today. I'll kind of call out incident response forensics, right? OT incident response forensics is a challenging field, right? There is not a lot of people with the skill sets to do that. And so, whether you're going to cover that gap in-house by developing capability or work with a third-party vendor that can bring in, teams that specialize in that, that's something you need to have, in your playbook or in your toolkit. And then you have backups. So, a lot of our operational technology, right? We do have manual processes that we can fall back on in the event of a cyber disruption. But the question is it sustainable, right? How long can you run those manual processes? And then how much does that degrade your operational capability, right? Just because you can do it manually doesn't mean you can run the same amount of trains down that track as if the system was operating correctly. So you need to understand, if you have to revert to manual processes, how long can you sustain it? Over how large of an area can you sustain that, right? And it's, as the Deutsche Bahn attack recently pointed out, right? Physical attacks could have cyber effects as well as cyber attacks having physical effects, right? So, you could have the greatest cyber defenses in the world, but, if somebody knows the right cable to cut, it will disrupt your operations. Okay.
I think one of the interesting things that we've kind of stumbled is not the right term, but through the last 6 to 8 months of really diving into the architecture of Amtrak OT networks, so really what the meat and potatoes of what we're talking about here is between DC and Boston and the Northeast corridor, right? So if you're familiar with the Northeast corridor, anybody that has tracks and trains, they all somehow integrate in that 400, 500 miles of track. And Amtrak is responsible for a lot of that in some way, shape, or form. Maybe we own the track, maybe we own the wires that data are running on, maybe, insert scenario here, we touch that data or that some area of responsibility somehow. So when we're looking at some of these projects and we're enhancing our OT capabilities and we're putting things in that we've not traditionally done, or, for example, we work with our SOC, who I believe are watching right now, and we say, okay, we're going to take all of this 15 or 20-year-old equipment. We're going to figure out what kind of logs it produces. We're going to get those logs into a syslog server, and then we're going to send them off to our SOC. And then they get to the SOC, and it means absolutely nothing to them because this is PLC logic or whatever the case might be. It means nothing to the SOC. So there are some tools that SIP has deployed to help us enhance that or enrich that data a little bit. But really what we're dealing with in OT is a whole lot of data that means nothing to anyone except for the engineers that are maintaining that system. So what are we going to do with that from a cyber perspective? That's a very important piece that we have to figure out. Interestingly enough, zero trust is one buzzword that everybody here is running around, but OT has been kind of, using another rail reference here, building steam for like the last 5, maybe even 10 years, just quietly in the background. And now it's right here in front of all of us. Everybody's looking at ICS, IoT, OT security. And a part of that has not been defined by anyone that I know of yet in terms of, we get all this data out of OT. Now what do we do with it, right? How do we produce some kind of actionable alert or alarm in the SOC? Cylus has some capabilities to do some of that. A lot of other vendors have capabilities to do. some of the equipment that we put in has the capability to do. Okay, so now say we figured out how to get enriched actionable data into the SOC. What does that mean now? So we've detected something on a live moving train. Are we going to stop it? Are we going to call somebody in our National Operations Center and say, stop that train right now? We've detected something unusual? Probably not. And I may not have my job for much longer if that was our logic behind what we do. So there's a whole other set of business rules that needs to be written to define what do we do with all of this data,
Yeah, and I think, playbooks helps with the SOC response, right? And actually having dedicated folks within your SOC that, have some training or some understanding of the operational environment, right? I think is key to truly interpret that alerting and understand the ramifications of what you see. It's worth the time and investment to have, some folks within your SOC that understand it.
So we will move into the next slide here. And I think lessons learned from a lot of the projects that we've been working on. I had a really hard time with this one. There are a lot of lessons that I have learned in a very short period of time. And I think Jesse said it earlier, since he's been at Amtrak, it's just been a fire hose of information coming in. And I feel like everybody can agree with that, especially when when you pick up something as large as what Amtrak has, or even as small as, the smallest transit agency out there, or short line railroad. There's so much data in the cyber that you could extract for the cyber world. Figuring out what to do with it is one of the hardest parts. So out all of that, the real line has been drawn between cyber and safety. It's been referenced a number of times today, but there is no question in my mind that cyber has an impact on safety, and safety could potentially have an impact on cyber, depending on which way you go at skinning that animal. So cybersecurity is a component of safety, right? How we protect this new cloud system that's going in to service trains flowing between DC and Boston could have a major impact on safety. And I believe the last presentation showed that there are pathways and mechanisms to do that. That's John's area, not mine. I largely look at how do I stop it from happening. But at the end of the day, safety and security are interwoven, deep threads in the fabric of all of that.
Yeah, and so the second point, right? Understanding the maturity of your environment. I think that's very key, especially if the rush to the cloud, right? So there could be immense pressure from business units or things to move things to the cloud for cost or capability or other mechanisms, right? As from cybersecurity perspective, right? We need to make sure that the cloud environments are ready to move sometimes those critical systems into that environment. There was an organization I was working with a while ago that was very cloud first centric, right? They wanted to move a lot of on-prem solutions into the cloud. And the cloud services team was, all for it, right? Their position was the cloud is more secure than, the on-prem environment is. But, at the time these discussions were happening, we were conducting penetration tests within that organization's cloud environment, and we were running rampant through it, right? So there was a disconnect between what they thought their cloud environment was ready for versus what it was actually ready for, right? So, do you think or do you know, right? And so assessments are a good way to determine the knowing part, right? We actually performed the test. We did find vulnerabilities. We were able to do all these things. So, their environment was not at a maturity level that would support the systems, the criticality of the systems they wanted to move into that environment at that time, right? So understanding, where you're at as an organization, not only from like an OT perspective, right, but also at each level, right, IT, cloud, understanding your maturity, and then, based on system criticality, understanding the risks involved with moving those systems or connecting those systems, right? I mean, it's here, it's been here, it's going to continue. So really understanding those risks and your maturity level will help you get there safely.
For cross-functional projects with many stakeholders, I mentioned the Northeast Corridor earlier on in the presentation. The Northeast Corridor is truly anybody and everybody who has anything to do with rail. We all work together between DC and Boston somehow, some way. Can anybody take a guess at what that looks like from a networking perspective? Right. So what you're dealing with is multiple states, multiple departments of transportation, multiple class 1 railroads, multiple transit authorities. I could go on for days here. Now, I'm not saying that those networks are all interconnected and we can communicate across them, because that would not be true, right? But somehow, some way, there are communications paths there that exist. So what we do on the Amtrak side could have a major impact on a Department of Transportation. And in fact, there have been times where my phone has rang and it has been a representative from a Department of Transportation that says, TSA just told me that I have to do this, but we don't even own the network that this equipment operates over. That's you guys. So what are you doing about it? And then we get into a conversation that's essentially says, well, I mean, I could talk to you for a week about what we do about it, but how are you going to respond to TSA? I don't think you can push all of that off on Amtrak, but maybe they can. Who's to really say? So the important part here is that we have to figure out how we all communicate this out. Amtrak is not afraid to tell any of our partners, what it is and how we protect the network, or yes, we've already submitted for our authorizations, or we've submitted our documentation, but we can't if the communication is not there. At my level, it may not be. I'm sure that it is at higher levels, but I wouldn't be surprised if you get an email or a phone call from me if you are a DOT or a class 1 or another provider within the Northeast corridor, because there's a lot of conversations that we need to have right now that aren't necessarily happening at the levels where change could be quickly impacted on the network. My last piece on that is, in the event of an incident somewhere on the Northeast corridor, we have to have a way for that information to spread like wildfire amongst all of the partners, because it could very well have an impact on everyone that operates in the Northeast corridor. So, conversations like that are also important. And I don't know exactly how we do that, but just having the channel or line of communication open is really very important. Also, on the stakeholder side of this, vendors are my favorite people in the world, because they give us what we need. And hopefully they give us products that could be certified to a certain degree of maturity in terms of security. And if I'm being fair, that doesn't always happen. But if I'm being honest, we don't, as it was said earlier, we don't always give them the right requirements. So it's a very important two-way relationship that I don't want a product delivered with known vulnerabilities. I shouldn't have to ask for those vulnerabilities to be patched. But at the same time, it can't just be an implicit communication that says you need to patch all of your vulnerabilities, right? It needs to be written somewhere. So there is a lot of work, not at Amtrak, but across the industry, especially in North America, where we really don't have a lot of regulation right now, to start honing some of that in. I believe I already hit on the collaborate far and wide part, and it is,
I think you did.
Yeah, I actually have a running list right now of transit agencies, railroads, departments of transportation, whoever I can get a name and an email for. I have it on my computer. So I'm happy to take business cards if you fall into one of those categories, because we're really looking to pick up those communications.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. And I mean, like as the rail itself, right? We all operate across, different owners, operators of rail across the country. Our systems, our PTC systems, our dispatch systems have to interconnect in a similar fashion. And so, whether it's a partner railroad or a vendor, right? How are you managing that risk when they come in? Right? Again, where's the DMARC? Do you have, security devices? Do you have, an IDS or an IPS? Do they come in through a DMZ? How is that managed? How are those identities managed? Right? What do you do if, one of your vendors suffers, a ransomware attack? Do you know exactly which of your systems are interconnected with theirs? Do you know who within that third party has access into your network? Right. So understanding, all the interdependencies for, each vendor or each partner is very important. And you have to, annotate that and make sure that it's understood, and then, have a playbook written for it. Right. So that, if it comes out that, vendor X has been affected, that's just a playbook that your SOC could execute, saying, okay, we need to isolate these systems, or we need to, monitor these accounts, while the investigation plays out to figure out how far the compromise went.
We've thought about this a lot over, a long period of time now, in terms of if something happens in our networks, obviously Amtrak, but other than Amtrak, how far and how wide could this go? And the answer is probably not all that far, but obviously there is a long way that it could go, right? So the time is really now, both to consider what we're doing for cloud connectivity. It's coming, it's here, it's not going anywhere. I've come to realize that. There was a point in time where I took a pretty hard stance on, no, I'm not connecting those two things together. And I wouldn't say that I've changed my mind. It's not always a good idea, but I've come to the light a little bit in terms of, okay, we can make this work if we go about it the right way. And there are a lot of ways that we can do that, a lot of frameworks, a lot of standards to follow, but a lot of discussions and a lot of work ahead of us to get there.
Yep. And then obviously auditing and assessing, right? Continuous audits and assessments is how you maintain these type of environments, right? Because changes occur on a daily basis. And if they're not well documented, that's where you can really start to get into trouble. There's a lot of threat actors that have been able to gain access into environments through, a misconfiguration or an undocumented change, right, that nobody was aware of. And so I think, at this time, we'll kind of open it up for any questions. Yes, ma'am. So I think the leadership at Amtrak does recognize the entanglement between cybersecurity and safety, right? Like they're, you can look at them as two sides of the same coin, or whatever. But really, I've found, and I've had to do this in many different organizations over the years, right? Is trying to get buy-in from the key stakeholders on why is cybersecurity important to me. And I think I've found my most success is, you have to know your audience. You have to understand the culture and the language that they speak within that culture, right? So I've spent 22 years in the Army, coming up as a cyber defense warrant officer, right? I found I worked in special forces units and things like that. So as an example, one of my challenges was trying to explain to one of the special forces teams on why cybersecurity was important to their mission, right? Because we had some incidents cybersecurity related. And really, it's when you can make them understand how it impacts them and their mission, right? So I wrote a cybersecurity brief using language that would make sense to a special forces team, right? I mapped, cybersecurity concerns to mission objectives and how it could impact mission objectives, right? And so it's the same concept you can use across any organization, right? Whether it's, OT service owners, right, that don't understand why, we've been doing it this way for 20 years. Why do I have to change the way I do things now, right? You have to speak to it in a language that they understand. You can't just say it from, the cybersecurity perspective, right? If you try to use just pure cybersecurity language, you're generally not going to be successful, right? If you can put it into terms, operational terms that, hey, this is how this impacts my mission, or this is how this impacts my system, and this is the effects that this could cause, I've found that, you can generally be successful, right? And the key is, in their minds, you want to be a partner, right? I always approach people as I'm a partner to help you succeed in a safe manner, right? I want you to be successful. I want you to be safe and successful. And here, if we can do these things or change this procedure or, patch this system, this will make you, more safe and more successful to complete your mission. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
There are a couple of angles to answer that. I would say that a lot of it flows through mandatory reporting right now back to the government, and then we use them as flowbacks to us. When I sat back and looked at that, I thought to myself, that's great. That's what we're supposed to do. We know that they've got a handle on it. But what happens if it's in the Northeast corridor and I have an interconnection with the network where that ransomware is sitting right now? Is that information going to get from the appropriate authorities back to us fast enough and with enough specific information so that we could take whatever actions we needed as quickly? And the answer is probably yes, of course. However, there's nothing wrong with us going out and creating, just our own channels of communication. And I'll be honest with you, a lot of the times it's just a friendly email like, hey, what's going on? What projects are you doing? Just in the last month, I think we've probably talked with 3 or 4 different international railroads, just kind of what projects are you working on? Hey, that sounds cool. Who did you work with? But in terms of interagency communication within the Northeast corridor, obviously the first approach is follow the channels that are required, and then we go from there, right? So if I have a contact at, let's say you work at an agency, I don't know if you do or not, but let's say you work in an agency and you have someone that you can pick up the phone and talk to directly. I mean, how can you beat that? You know what I mean? So we are building a list. We're happy to put anybody and everybody on that list as long as it's relevant. And then, we have, in some cases, bi-monthly calls. Some cases we have a couple calls a month with different providers or transit agencies or railroads. It just depends on what it is that we need to talk about at that moment in time. So to answer, I don't think I answered your question at all, but to answer it, it's just, we do what's required of us first and foremost. And then if we have other channels that we can work to get more information faster, that we'll do it.
Okay, any other questions? All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.